Kirby's 30th anniversary is finished and it is still quite hard to comprehend how amazing it turned out to be. To some extent we expected an accurate celebration, but no one could have probably guessed the sheer amount of passion put behind the whole event after keeping our anticipations in check, considering how Nintendo handled Mario, Zelda or anniversaries in general. Introducing Kirby's birthday with one of the most quality platformers and the first proper 3D one on top of that could have been considered to be enough, but instead we received one original huge step for the franchise, an entertaining original spin-off for In Between, and a nearly perfect remake to one of Kirby's best adventures. This cannot be taken for granted by any means, and it was probably also a solid proof of perfect time management, planning and execution from the developer's side. Now that our bellies are full and the great Kirby offensive finally ended, there's only one question left. What comes next? To close the case swiftly, nothing. We just played through 3 different Kirby games in 1 year, so it's natural to assume that 2023 will be silent for the rest of the year. Considering how the main staff is most likely fully concentrating on the next mainline title, which should take a few years, we are probably about to enter a well-deserved drought for the following months. First, let's address this ominous next big successor to the Forgotten Land. Regarding the Forgotten Land's huge victory of being the most sold entry in the series within a year, it takes no future sight to envision another 3-dimensional platformer. If something works, Kirby likes it to play the game safe and simply improve on what worked with a few additions. This means we are probably receiving another game akin to the Forgotten Land, with a focused but dynamic camera and linear level design. Of course we are talking about 3D, so there are way more opportunities to tweak this formula, but for the sake of consistency, let's assume the gameplay will be fairly similar. Now, our first thought should be something like Kirby Triple Deluxe. A safe successor to Return to Dreamland with a couple of new but not groundbreaking features, just as described. With this path, they can iron out some shortcomings of the Forgotten Land and maybe even improve on ideas that seem to work perfectly fine. Another option is Planet Robobot, a perfected reskin basically of Return to Dreamland, which is still considered to be peak 2D Kirby. The premise of the Forgotten Land is noticeably different, however. Unlike Return to Dreamland, the Forgotten Land doesn't take place in Dreamland and presents unique visuals for the franchise, just like Planet Robobot. So by developing another Forgotten Land, which is set in Kirby's home planet, the visual style would already be quite disparate and make a possible follow-up inimitable. Hard to imagine, but we are still missing out on a proper 3D adventure in Dreamland, so shifting the setting to Kirby's actual home turf, the conditions are already in the follow-up's favor. Triple Deluxe is a fantastic successor, no one can deny that, but to be completely honest, it lives kinda in the shadows of Return to Dreamland and Planet Robobot. Basically, between the perfected game and the one who kickstarted Kirby's modern career. It doesn't do things too differently, and despite the fact it uses unique settings, there are still whimsical places similar to Dreamland's most areas. And because I can already feel the arrows targeted at me, again, Triple Deluxe is a fantastic follow-up and arguably better than Return to Dreamland. So, while the visuals are off to a good start, what about the gameplay? This is where future 3D successors can possibly differentiate themselves quite heavily. Return to Dreamland was fundamentally based on Kirby's adventure, but the Forgotten Land takes inspiration of a couple of experiments and is independent for the most part. The sky is the limit, and it only depends on where the creators see the true potential. Take a look at copy abilities, for example. For many players, they felt a little underdeveloped and didn't hold up to the versatility of the 2D counterparts. Only natural since they have to figure their way out in 3D, but people are not quite aware how sharply different copy abilities in 3D are. Focusing on this feature, Kirby games in 3D could lean heavily on the action aspect of skills and focus on a fast-paced gameplay akin to a Bayonetta game. I know, an outlandish comparison at first sight, but not so insane considering how Kirby games usually end. Being completely honest, I can even imagine a new mainline title completely focusing on fighting, since the boss fights were one of the most beloved features of the Forgotten Land. Imagine Super Kirby Clash but in 3D and as a full game, flavored with additional level that would supplement the core of the action. Name it something like Kirby Colosseum, where the main hub world is a huge arena with a little village, where fighting is the core theming of the whole game. You're participating in different cups similar to Battle Royale and use copy abilities in order to win. With a setup like that, the next mainline title could fully focus on Kirby's trademark skill and expand all the copy abilities with impressive movesets. Since it would take place in Dreamland and tell a fairly basic narrative, it would be the perfect opportunity to flesh out the core cast, like Kracko, DDD, Meta Knight or even Dynablade. All these classic classic foes. Naturally, this sounds rather repetitive, even if each fight gives its best to differentiate itself from each other, but to make up for this, you will explore the outside of this battle-focused place and enter different short level to maybe find materials and items for bonus costumes or enhancing your abilities in some way. I'm kinda tired of certain games following set conventions when there's so much you can do with progression. A platformer doesn't need to track down a world map in a linear fashion, and in my example, it would be completely up to the player how many he wants to discover, or if he wants to discover them at all. To give it one final kick, it would be possible to completely beat the game without entering a single optional level, just with your basic stats or gears. But of course, it would be extremely challenging. This kind of freedom in gameplay, progression and difficulty is what the series needs to stay fresh, and they spontaneously came up with a possible interesting idea that would be completely unalike to the Forgotten Land. Going back to this game, there's also still the potential of the mouthful mode. Even though the Forgotten Land made great use of this special gimmick, there are 100% unused ideas they had to leave out. Principally, I would welcome the comeback, but it would lead back to the problem with Triple Deluxe I just mentioned. It's always more favorable if a game can show off its own identity, and it's not like Mouthful was underutilized in its debut title. Simply copying everything but with a slightly new spin to it would certainly work, but it's hard to imagine since the series would become stale again. On top of that, you have to also consider that 3D games take more time to develop than their 2D counterparts, and the creators would have to balance the risk of trying something new, potentially failing, or going the safe way and risking becoming tedious. The series is at its highest point right now, and it's important to use that momentum to shift Kirby from this AA franchise to the big guys like Mario. Nonetheless, we can still not leave out the option of more 2D games. In fact, they didn't even wait a whole year and immediately released Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, showing their willingness to still explore two-dimensional games. The only problem I see with this approach is the manpower of the team. We cannot be sure, but going by their recent track record, it seems like they're able to develop multiple Kirby games at once, otherwise we wouldn't receive 3 titles within a year. Normally, these secondary entries are smaller spin-offs, or in the case of Return to Dreamland Deluxe, a simple remake. Of course, they added some new features, but this is nothing that couldn't be implemented in a brief development cycle, and is mostly reusing either assets or ideas from past entries. Creating an original 2D platformer still takes time. Star Allies is the perfect instance of a title that was clearly rushed and therefore not as well received as other titles. On top of that, no matter what you prefer, 3D games are generally more popular than 2D ones and are regarded as more ambitious, memorable adventures. There's certainly no way they are going back to 2D after the extremely well-judged Forgotten Land. The only way to make another 2D Kirby justifiable are simply remakes, since they cater to nostalgia and work to some extent, or something completely different. By different, I don't mean a simple new adventure, but entire shake-up from the Return to Dreamland formula. Controls and gameplay need to be different, the visual style to some extent as well, and it must give off the feeling of being a well-deserved alternative to a potential 3D title. This, however, would probably take time, as I mentioned, maybe even more time than usual, since it needs serious reevaluation of how 2D Kirby could evolve. One final option would be a mixture of 2D and 3D. To be honest, I'm a little surprised that they didn't try this approach in the Forgotten Land due to the set camera and option to switch up the perspective whenever they like, but it may be for the right. This is coming more from my personal standpoint, but most of the time, when 3D games are switching into 2D, it doesn't work as well as creators probably imagine. The controls are often designed for 3D movement in mind, which is why the very same movement simply doesn't feel natural when restricted. Think of Sonic, or maybe even Mario Galaxy to some extent. When people are buying a big 3D game, this is what they expect. At the end of the day, while it might be a topic of preference, I think we can all agree that Kirby should follow to be ambitious. 3D or 2D, it doesn't really matter, as long as the next step is adding value to the franchise by either improving on the Forgotten Land or using the potential for something completely unique. If I would have to set my cards, it would be a simple Forgotten Land follow-up, since it is just the most safe thing to do. Nevertheless, I still have a secret Joker card in my hand, showing the name Kirby Air Ride 2.